Welcome everyone to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. Our speaker today will be Jim Lucier, Executive Vice President of Indotronix. Jim will be presenting on leveraging AI to advance contingent workforce diversity in your talent supply chain. We would like to make this interactive at the end of Jim's presentation, so please be sure to put a question or comment in the chat area for Jim to respond to. At this time, I will now turn the program over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Looking forward to both my presentation and a discussion afterwards. If you have any questions while I'm going through the presentation, you can pop them into the chat box, and I'll either address them as we're going along or address them at the end. So again, today we're going to talk about leveraging AI to advance contingent workforce diversity in your talent supply chain. And I'll tell you, the origin of this presentation really comes from some meetings that I've had with chief procurement officers, other people in procurement and sourcing, and in supplier diversity. So, as a category, contingent workforce often sits in procurement, either as its own category or maybe in professional services or in indirect procurement. And so I heard one person say about a year ago at a roundtable that we were having with some procurement professionals, he's a supplier diversity leader for Cisco. And he said, I always start talking about supplier diversity, but today the discussion ends up with workforce diversity. And so we're going to tie the two together today. And I'm looking to advance along with my slides, and they don't want to advance for me. Okay, here we go. So the business case for diversity, many companies, maybe most companies, your company included, has been working on workforce diversity for your full-time employees for a number of years, maybe decades even. As the same goes for supplier diversity. You've probably paid attention to and maybe set objectives and goals and been measuring and tracking against your goals for spend with diverse suppliers. So we know that there's a business case for diversity, and every year actually McKinsey does a study. This quote comes from May 2020. I just saw something recently, I think it was in January of this year, an updated McKinsey report. But, the bottom line is diversity wins, right, in your supply chain. So, we know that for supplier diversity, it's been something I'm sure you've been working on for many years. Again, we know that for workforce diversity, generally speaking, because your companies have probably been working on that as well. But contingent workforce diversity has kind of been the missing piece. And there was a study done a couple of years ago by staffing industry analysts with, I'll say, the buyers of a contingent workforce, oftentimes in procurement and sourcing. And, the ones that are engaging the staffing suppliers and the consulting firms, the firms and vendors managing projects, 63% of those professionals that were surveyed indicated that contingent workforce diversity was going to become a higher priority due to the recent social upheaval. Again, this was about 2.5 years ago. So this report was updated around 6 months ago. And in the update, it said that most of these leaders, they were surveyed again. Most of these leaders said that they still hadn't really done anything about it, but 80% or more of them said it was still important. We're working on it. We're trying to do something about it. So I just ask you the question, you think about, has contingent workforce diversity or workforce diversity throughout your talent supply chain, your supply chain of staffing suppliers and project vendors and consulting firms, has that become a higher priority in your company? And if it has, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can assess performance, set goals and assess performance for that. So in that same study, SIA found that there are some significant barriers to progress. And really one of the most important barriers was lack of diversity data. So the contingent workforce, as you probably know, onboards differently than full-time employees, right? So they're your extended workforce. Those workers are not onboarding like your full-time employees. So you're generally not collecting demographic data and doing other things that you do when you onboard full-time employees. So some of the barriers, a couple that were mentioned here, 57% of the buyers, again, right, the people on your side, cited a lack of information from staffing partners and other vendors regarding candidate or contingent worker diversity. So, the majority of the respondents said, we're not getting any information from staffing suppliers about the workers on assignment with our company. 42% said that they were really just focused on supplier diversity rather than the talent diversity or the contingent workforce diversity. And there was a little bit of confusion around that. And a little more than a third said that even when they tried to collect data from contingent workers directly, that workforce tended to opt out, that there was very limited agreement for opting in and providing any data to measure demographics of the contingent workforce. So that's a really significant barrier. In fact, so much so that sometimes this presentation, or at least a version of it, I title Breaking Down the Data Barrier to Advancing Contingent Workforce Diversity. So that's a really significant barrier. And probably as you think about your own organization and the suppliers that you work with, you realize that you don't have a lot of data about the workforce, particularly not the kind of demographic data that you have regarding your full-time workforce. So one more piece that I'll take out of this research, and that is from steps to success. And one of the critical steps is being able to measure and track workforce demographics. So if you think about your company and your full-time workforce, generally today we see, well, first of all, what we see is that, companies have to complete a report. If a company has 100 or more employees, 50 or more if they're a federal contractor or subcontractor, they have to complete a report called the EEO-1 form for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that report is where you put in demographics around your full-time workforce, right? So not around any individuals, but by name, but you put in numbers of within certain demographics, right? Particularly gender and ethnicity. And there's a way to collect that information. The EEOC suggests one, using a voluntary self-identification survey, and two, for those employees that don't voluntarily self-identify. Generally, your HR group would make some kind of informed guess or estimate about your workforce demographics. So those get measured and tracked. If you work in a Fortune 5, Fortune 1000 company, you're probably seeing that your company is not only measuring this internally and submitting an EEO1 report, but often now those reports are being published on the internet, on your company websites, maybe as a standalone, maybe as part of a larger ESG report or something like that. So, generally companies are measuring, tracking, and even making public general information about the workforce. But again, this is a serious limitation in trying to advance diversity in your contingent workforce, because generally there's not a way for companies to expand and track diversity metrics in their contingent workforce. So here I'll just ask you to think about, do you currently have a way that you're able to expand and track diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics in your contingent workforce? With those workers on assignment in your organization, from staffing suppliers and from consulting firms and from project vendors, do you have a way to measure and track that information? If you don't, then this is probably a blocking factor for you in terms of trying to advance contingent workforce diversity in your organization. So now we're going to talk about what you can do about it. So we've developed some means for you to create a roadmap to contingent workforce diversity. We talked at the beginning about how research has long since proven that that workforce diversity helps improve company productivity, performance, including financial performance, and that supplier diversity improves an organization's supply chain performance. But now we're talking about extending what we know about gains that can be achieved through diversity by advancing contingent workforce diversity, really making it a business mandate for social good in your talent supply chain. So meanwhile, providers like staffing firms and consulting firms and others, and practitioners, maybe like you, are trying to determine how they can assess contingent workforce diversity, and then what to do about it, because often there aren't any metrics at all. If there are some, they're not very comprehensive, and there's no way really to determine how accurate those metrics or demographics are. And so it's very difficult to proceed without some necessary information and some needed resources. And so through our sister company, CPAL, you can use advanced AI, DEI technology to help your company build a more robust and diverse contingent workforce. And we're going to talk about 3 steps for doing that, including assessment, planning, and implementation. So step 1 is the assessment. And again, this is kind of really beginning with, if you kind of can't identify your current situation, if you don't know what the demographics of your contingent workforce look like today, if you don't have a picture of that, how can you do anything about it? How can you see where your gaps are? And how can you make any plans to close those gaps? And so that's always the first step, right? Some type of assessment. And so with our AI diversity algorithm, you're able to assess your contingent workforce distribution, or the demographics of the entire contingent workforce, by gender and ethnicity. You don't have to rely on any of your suppliers reporting this information to you, nor do you have to rely on surveying the workers in the contingent workforce and rely on their rely on them opting in to provide this information. This is a very simple, non-intrusive way to just accurately assess kind of any workforce or part of the workforce. And it only requires the worker names, first and last name, and location. And by location, I simply mean country, right? So for all of your workers, right, all your workers on assignment, that information sits somewhere. It may sit in a vendor management system. It may sit in an applicant tracking system, an HRIS, some type of onboarding system. You know, there's somewhere that you have a list of the first and last names of these workers that are on temporary assignment, that are, you know, contract or contingent workers that are part of your extended workforce. And that's all we need, first and last name and the country where they're located. And then if you want to add other pieces of information, for instance, like job titles and wages, we're able to provide some equity and inclusion metrics too. And so you can kind of just take a look at the image below. You see how we'll take the list of names, right? Upload those into our AI diversity algorithm, and then assess demographics at an aggregate level to develop some analytics, insights, and reports. So I'm going to give you some examples of that to start with. Really just the basic analytics, and I can tell you that the reporting gets to be, you know, very comprehensive, and that's where we kind of develop the gap analysis and insights. But so just imagine this. You had a list of names, you have 1,000 contingent workers, you have 500, you have 1,000, you have 10,000, right? It's usually, it's about a 3 or 5 minute process to actually create that list of names and upload it into our diversity algorithm through our platform. And you're near immediately, able to develop gender and ethnic diversity metrics. Okay, so metrics that look like this, right? We're not looking to identify any individuals or groups of individuals, but we're looking at the workforce in aggregate. So any data set, the entire workforce, or the IT workforce or the call center workforce, right? We can look at it by labor categories and other ways, but any data set, right? So just from the first and the last name, applying our algorithm, which is simply, you know, a set of instructions that are based on sociolinguistics. In the history of naming, there's a mathematical model that applies, and we're able to develop these type of demographic analytics at the aggregate level, right? So gender on a binary basis, and then ethnicity according to, in this example, ethnic classifications in the US. Okay. We can take it a step further. I talked about if you add additional pieces of information, we can provide other metrics. So here's some other metrics. This is how, in this data set, the specific suppliers are performing, right? What their workforces look like. And I don't think this should be used in any punitive way, but definitely in an informative way, right? Most of your suppliers don't have, I'd say maybe not any of your suppliers have any type of service level agreements or KPIs or anything like that, where they're expected to provide certain levels of diversity. However, it can be very interesting, right, and informative to know what levels of diversity suppliers are actually providing. It might help you determine, for instance, where you see some diversity gaps, where you might be able to manage your supply base a little differently, right? You could provide opportunities to suppliers that seem to be able to provide more talent in certain areas of diversity. We can even break this down geographically, right? So we can see, for instance, we talked about breaking down by maybe labor category, but we could break it down by geography as well. And so, for instance, you might have some suppliers that are only working within certain geographies, and they're providing high levels of diversity in certain areas. And yet in other geographies, you're lacking that diversity. And maybe those suppliers aren't working there. So you can make some supply-based adjustments to potentially close some of the diversity gaps that you have, right? So again, just information that you can have to help manage your suppliers, because I'm sure that you scorecard your suppliers on all different types of metrics, right? So if diversity is important in your contingent workforce, it would probably be important to have some metrics around the workers on assignment with different suppliers. All right. And then I also talked about adding some information around wages and titles to be able to develop both equity and inclusion metrics. So when I say equity metrics, I'm really talking about wage equity, right? Or wage disparity. So, diversity is kind of at the surface and really table stakes, we'll say, right? As we look at the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion analysis. So let's just say, again, on a binary basis, you had equal distribution of, males and females across your workforce. However, when you looked at the wages, you dug a little deeper, you might find that there was either a small or maybe even an extreme wage disparity, by gender, right? Or the same thing could be said by ethnicity, right? So that's equity. What happens if there's not pay equity, or if there's pay disparity in an organization? Well, we know what happens. You tend to turn people over, right? People find out about wage differences, and of course they'll feel like they're treated unfairly. And if the wages are different, that's actually the case, and they'll look for work elsewhere, right? So there are some very practical applications of this, right? I mean, first of all, kind of looking at the metrics we looked at before, if you have big gaps, big gender gaps, big ethnicity gaps in your organization, you're probably missing out on a lot of talent. So how can you open the gate wider and really access more talent? And in the case of equity and inclusion, right? After you've brought talent into your organization, how can you develop and retain that talent? And of course, fair treatment with wages is very important. And then we can look at, we call this an inclusion metric, actually, when we look at role equity, right? So, we've looked at the gender distribution and the ethnic distribution across the workforce, but what does it look like across different levels of the workforce, right? So, for instance, at the associate level, the manager level, the director level, the vice president level, or the executive level, right? Are people being included, right? Is everyone in the workforce, including the contingent workforce, being included for promotions, right? And different levels of achievement and advancement in the organization. So, these metrics become really telling. And it's a rare case today where companies have a good way to develop these metrics for their contingent workforce. Now, again, these are the type of metrics that they are developing, and I'm sure your companies are developing for your full-time workforce. But you have to realize that your contingent workforce is part of your total workforce. And many companies, it makes up to a third or more of the total workforce. And these are workers, the contingent workers, they're not generally at a separate campus or at a separate building, right? They're often just working side by side with your full-time employees. They work with them, they build products with them, they serve customers with them. And so that's why we say this is, really needs to be a business mandate. And it kind of only makes sense that you'd want to be able to do the same type of analysis, right? And maybe then use that analysis for initiatives with your contingent workforce that you're currently doing with your full-time workforce. And that's where this leads. So, once you're able to develop demographics, you get a picture of what that workforce looks like, right? Again, this isn't about any individual, but it's about maybe a department, a labor category, locations, geographies, right? Or even the entire workforce. Where do you see diversity gaps? And maybe where are there equity and inclusion gaps when we talk about, pay equity, right? And role inclusion. Where do you see those gaps? You have to be able to see the gaps to do anything about it. And so now that we've developed the demographics, we can start to see within the metrics, it looks like we have a pretty serious gap here, right? We have a major gender gap, right? Or we have a major ethnic gap, or we seem to have a, pay equity gap. So how can we build a plan to address those gaps? And, if you take a look at the image below here, again, I think this is about taking your contingent workforce assessment and really laying it side by side next to, on top of what you're doing with your full-time workforce, so that you can, get that one workforce alignment. You can have alignment between your contingent workforce and your full-time workforce. And when you put them side by side, right, or lay one on top of the other, you can see the gaps. You can do that gap analysis, and you can pick the things that you say, hey, we really need to work on this. This looks like an area where we have a gap and we should do some work. And it may be work that you do with, the HR group does it. Talent acquisition group does it. The diversity group does it. Maybe you're involved with it. You bring your suppliers in, could be your staffing suppliers or the consulting firms. If you have an MSP that's managing your contingent workforce, right? If you're using a VMS, a vendor management system, or any other type of technology, when it comes to trying to build diversity into your contingent workforce, there are a lot of parties that need to come together, and you need to bring those moving parts together as a part of your plan to address any diversity gaps that you have within your contingent workforce. Again, as I'm going along, I just want to mention one more time that if you have questions, because people often do, right? We're talking about a new technology here. When I was talking about step one, right? We're talking about a new technology. In step two, we're talking very generally about planning to address gaps. Maybe you have a question about, a specific type of gap and maybe a way to plan to address that gap. So if you have those questions, just drop them into the chat and we'll take a look at them in a few minutes. And if you don't, when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll just review a couple of questions that I get commonly asked, because maybe you don't feel like asking a question today, but you may have it. So let me move along here to step three, right? So again, step one, we developed the demographics. We got a picture of what that contingent workforce looks like. In step two, we kind of measured that maybe against our full-time workforce or any corporate goals that you have for workforce diversity, and developed a plan. And so now in step three, we're going to implement that plan, right? So you developed a plan, or soon you have some type of planning document, right? That planning document's going to identify the gap and you know, what your goals are, objectives are in terms of closing that gap, and maybe a timeline for doing it, and who's going to do what. And so we put that plan in place, and then start, you know, kind of moving through your contingent workforce and talent acquisition process, right? And sourcing talent for your contingent workforce based on your diversity goals. And then periodically measure that. I'd say generally maybe on a quarterly basis, and see what's happening, right? Like, how can we move the needle? Is it moving? Are the things that we're doing actually causing some positive change? Are we advancing contingent workforce diversity? Can we point to it, right? We had a baseline, we had a benchmark. This is where we were 3 months ago, and now this is where we are 3 months later. And it gives you a chance to, of course, do the things that you normally do when you have a plan to achieve any objectives that you have, right? You measure, you benchmark, you devise a plan, put your plan in place, and then remeasure, make adjustments to your plan, and then remeasure again. And so generally, what we see is that companies may measure this probably 2 to 4 times a year, right? To make sure they're making progress, and to determine where maybe additional adjustments may be made, right? And you can have some reporting in your organization, again, like you do for all kind of other types of objectives. So, this has been, as I mentioned at the outset, right, that the most critical barrier that's been identified in terms of, blocking the advancement of diversity in the contingent workforce is being able to kind of measure and track it, and develop some analytics around it, and some reporting. And so now you have the ability, if advancing contingent workforce diversity, which really just means advancing workforce diversity, but bringing the contingent workforce into it, if that's important in your organization, this becomes a way to really help you do that. Breaking down the data barriers at the beginning, and then being able to show your progress once you get underway, and being able to report again, up to various departments, into HR, maybe into senior leadership, right? So if you just kind of want to do a summary here, what's your use case? Rather than just talking about the use case of, other organizations, how about your use case? This may be your situation. Let's think about it. If it is, has your company always tried to advance diversity in your full-time workforce, or at least kind of as far back? Has that been important to your company? Has it been important to your company to advance supplier diversity? If both of those things have been important to your company, I would say that advancing contingent workforce diversity is probably pretty important to your company too. But sometimes, there's so many different people that touch the contingent workforce, and, ownership of, well, who's really going to be responsible for contingent workforce diversity? Ownership of that maybe tends to be a little different than, I'll say, ownership of diversity in your full-time workforce, or ownership of supplier diversity in procurement or sourcing, right? So this is an opportunity for you to see if this is really important to your organization, and kind of who else you need to partner with or get on board. How can you bring the parties together, sourcing and procurement, and maybe HR and talent acquisition, and even diversity. But if your company, any people in your company sense some diversity gaps in the contingent workforce and want to do something about it, but don't have any real good means for gathering data and completing a gap analysis, then here's a solution for you, right? It's just as we just talked about. It's using CPAL's advanced AI to assess your company's current contingent workforce for gender and ethnic diversity. Remember, all it takes is creating a list of first and last names, right, by country. We can add additional data if that's important. All of that probably sits in some system of record for you right now, vendor management system, an ATS, an HRIS, et cetera. Probably takes you only minutes to upload that into our diversity portal. And depending upon, the size of the data set and the amount of reporting that you want done, it may be probably within 1 to a few days to get some advanced metrics back to you, and also to get some very comprehensive reporting. And from that, you can take that second step. We can help you with it, or it can be something you do on your own. It can be something that you do with kind of other service partners. And that's developed a plan to address the diversity gaps. And then following that is just actually implementing that plan and working with us. You can reassess it on a periodic basis to see how the plan is going. So I noticed that we do have a question in our chat. I'm going to go up to that right now. And here's the question. First of all, it says, thank you for the presentation. Well, you're quite welcome, and for bringing this important topic. It really is an important topic. And the question is, what is your experience in terms of direct and indirect benefits for organizations once they set a diversity plan, and the most difficult barrier to set it? So as I've mentioned a few times here, and I'll say it again, that all of the research, particularly around contingent workforce diversity, all of the research suggests that the number one barrier is simply knowing where to start. The HR group generally knows where to start when they look at the full-time workforce, because there are some type of demographics. The HR talent acquisition group onboards the full-time workers in employees in your full-time workforce, and generally collects voluntary self-identification data, and where they don't, they still have a responsibility to try to develop it for this EEO1 reporting. And so there's something to work with. There's some starting point. But with the contingent workforce or the extended workforce, generally no one has a starting point, whether it's sourcing and procurement or HR and talent acquisition or anyone else. There's no starting point, right? So you're probably working with supplier diversity right now and tracking diverse supplier spend. Well, imagine if you didn't know anything about your suppliers, right? Imagine if they didn't provide information about their diverse supplier status and things like that, right? If they didn't supply any of that information, you'd have no way to track, measure and track diverse supplier spend and performance with diverse suppliers and things like that. And that's really the issue. That's the blocking factor. That's the barrier. It's a data barrier. And that's what our technology is intended to do, to break down that data barrier. And so, what are the benefits when you can do that? The very first benefit is you just get some good information. You get a picture of what your contingent workforce looks like. You gain an understanding of the demographics of your organization, and you can take an even deeper dive, right, and gain that understanding from across the entire contingent workforce, by a labor category or department, by a location, even by various suppliers and vendors. So all different types of ways that you can gain this better understanding. And when you have literally a picture, right? Like, I mean, these are right. They're not just numbers, right? Now we can develop some charts and graphs and a lot of reporting and insights. And so you have a picture. And when you have that picture, you can see those gaps. And I think when you see the gaps, you get a lot of support for wanting to do something about them, right? And you also gain insights in terms of when you what does that gap look like, helps to inform you of the ways that you can, try to close those gaps, right? And when you close those gaps, I'll say, one of the, there are all these statistics. I didn't go into them, but that slide early on from McKinsey, they're an organization that has put out a lot of statistics over the years about increases in productivity and performance and even financial performance based upon greater diversity in an organization, including if it's just more gender diversity, or if it's a combination of more gender and ethnic diversity, or it's a combination of diversity at every level of the organization, including the executive level. So there are all these statistics out there, but in a way, those seem sometimes a little esoteric and not that tangible. I can tell you something very tangible, an extremely tangible benefit. So even today, as we're seeing a bit of a decline in the job market, we still see a worker shortage, a talent shortage for certain skills. And so, one of the ways that you benefit immediately your organization is that you begin to look for ways that you can actually reach out to more talent, right? Be increasing kind of, or opening the gate wider, to be able to source more diverse talent means you're sourcing more talent across the board, right? So what we see is that organizations that take this approach, they find out where these gaps are and they work on closing these gaps, right? Actually end up closing not just diversity gaps, but talent gaps and talent shortages in their organizations. And their staffing performance, their recruiting performance, all of those metrics tend to improve. And we know how important that is to an organization, right? And if you can improve those metrics, you tend to save cost in your talent supply chain. You tend to, right? If you fill jobs quicker, jobs don't stay open. Maybe you source talent directly, don't have to rely as much on third parties. You have a real opportunity to drive down some of the cost of your contingent workforce or your extended workforce. So, those are two very immediate benefits that you can get. And then over time, again, some of these other things are going to kick in, right? We know that you're going to have probably a more productive workforce, a workforce that you'll retain better, right? A workforce that will attract additional workers to your organization. And all of those things lead to, greater performance by your company, including financial performance. So, there are immediate benefits and long-term benefits as well. So that's the only question that we had. But I just want to point you to this final slide here. And to my colleague, Anu, I will keep this slide up for a moment. If you take notice of her email address and her phone number, if you'd like some more information, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, if there's anything in particular you have a question about, if you'd like to just have a complimentary consultation, I'd ask you to reach out to Anu and follow up with her. And I'm sure she'll be glad to assist. And I'll certainly also get involved if you'd like to talk with me about anything that I presented today. And I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm actually under James, not Jim, but James Lucier, Lucier, on LinkedIn. And if you connect with Anu, connect with me, follow us on LinkedIn, you'll hear about all kinds of opportunities to get more information about how to advance contingent workforce diversity in your talent supply chain. So I want to thank you for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. Hope you learned a few things, and we look forward to connecting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that presentation. And it is a very important topic. And I know a lot of people took a lot of notes and information away with them today. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording from today. And also everyone that joins us today gets a continuing educational hour. So that will be included as well. Next week is going to be our final program of the membership year with our speaker, Amanda Prochaska. And that is going to be a special time. It's going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So at this point, we're going to close out the program, and everybody enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you.